Hi, welcome to Tales of Dread. There have been a lot of well-known UFO sightings in America. One of the most well-known ones happened in New Mexico in the summer of 1947. But the reported discovery of a downed alien spacecraft near Roswell was by no means the first such incident, with an equally mysterious crash having allegedly taken place in the neighboring state of Texas 50 years before. This week, we visit the Mystery of Aurora. It was still dark outside when Charlie Stevens had been awoken by an insistent knock on his bedroom door, wiping the sleep from his eyes. The tired 10-year-old got out of bed, washed his face in the sink across from him, and then put on his overalls. He walked to the front door of the house in an unsteady way. His father was waiting for him with his hat ready for him to put on. When they got to the barn, they saddled up their horses and started the short ride to the farm's farthest pasture to round up the cows. As usual, father and son rode in silence, both keen to complete their daily morning routine before returning to the farmhouse and the hearty breakfast, which would be waiting for them, courtesy of Mrs. Stevens overhead. The deep, dark blue of the nighttime sky was now finally surrendering to a much lighter shade. When both of the horses unexpectedly began to fuss as Charlie gently kicked at the sides of his mount, trying to encourage it to move on, he could see up ahead that his father was experiencing similar difficulties. They both got off their horses, and we're now trying to get the horses to move forward. When they became aware of a mysterious humming sound which was gradually increasing in volume, unable to motivate his horse, Charlie gave up and instead walked over to his father, who stood looking about himself, trying to figure out where the strange noise was coming from. A dark shape seemed to appear out of nowhere in the sky above them. It was slowly coming down through the clouds and moving north toward the nearby town of Aurora. As the strange object passed directly over them and continued on its journey, Charlie found himself staring up at it in wonder. Except birds and kites, and that one time at the county fair when he saw a hot air balloon. The youngster had never seen anything else that could fly before. It was long and cylindrical, with a bright light situated at one end that seemed to be powering it as the airship began to move away. The humming also stopped, leaving the father and son to watch in stunned silence. When the flying object was no longer in sight, the horses seemed to calm down, allowing the farmers to continue on their way. But then they heard a distant rumble to the north, and the sky there suddenly lit up brightly. Charlie turned to his father and yelled that the flying object must have crashed, pleading to go investigate further, but his father refused. Such things were best left to the authorities, and besides, if they both rode off on a wild goose chase, who would round up their cattle? Charlie wouldn't find out what happened to the mysterious airship and its passenger until the next day, when his father rode into town. Most reports involving unidentified flying objects are often dismissed out of hand due to a lack of supporting evidence. Even when there is video or photo evidence, it is usually of such poor or unclear quality that it is almost useless. Since drones have become more common, hoaxes have become all too common. In the same way, when there are more than one witness to an event, there are usually not that many of them. Often the testimony of multiple witnesses is conflicting, which undermines their overall credibility. It is also common for alleged alien spacecraft to leave little or no physical evidence of their passing, which is why the events that took place in Aurora in April of 1897 stand out from the overwhelming majority of American UFO encounters. In the early hours of the 17th of that month, something fell out of the skies above the town. Something that was witnessed by multiple residents, resulting in the death of its pilot and leaving a trail of wreckage across the town. Perhaps one of the more surprising aspects of the Aurora incident is the pragmatic response by the town's inhabitants to the event. Whereas the Roswell incident 50 years later would generate paranoia and national hysteria to the solicitous people of this small Texan community, the crash was treated like any other tragic accident. The incident took place at roughly 6 am as the earliest risers of the town was slowly going about their business. All of the witnesses agreed that the flying object, which they called an airship, was first seen coming from the south toward the settlement. As it got closer to the town, it kept getting lower and making a strange sound that people thought was caused by a mechanical problem. As it got closer and closer to the ground, it finally hit the windmill that Judge Spencer Proctor owned in the town. The craft was probably going about 12 miles per hour, according to estimates. When it collided with the structure, it immediately exploded, showering the judge's property with flaming wreckage and causing significant damage. Rescuers attending the scene were initially held back by the fires, unable to sift through the devastation until the flames had eventually died down. When they did, they found the badly burned remains of one person and a lot of twisted metal that looked like a mixture of aluminium and silver. The accident was reported right away to the authorities in the nearby city of Fort Worth, who sent a signals officer named Weems to look into it. In his subsequent report on the incident, the military investigator stated that he believed that downed craft was not of an earthly origin. The body of the pilot was too disfigured to give any clue as to its origins, but Weems surmised that it was too small to be that of an adult, more comparable in size to that of a human child. He also couldn't decide what the strange markings and glyphs on the wreckage were. He said that he thought they were from another planet, but there was nothing else he could do to find out. The pilot's body was buried in the town cemetery, and a pastor from out of town led the Christian service. Smaller pieces of the wreckage were buried with it, while the bigger pieces were picked up and thrown down. Judge Proctor as well, which had been damaged along with the windmill. Somewhat amazingly, an article written in the Dallas Morning News, which directly asserted that the airship had come from another world, was met with little interest by the national press. Markers were erected at the crash site in the grave of the pilot commemorating the event, but it would be a further 80 years before there was any significant interest in the incident. In 1973, a local reporter named Jim Mars went to the town to try to find out what happened. He managed to locate what he believed to be the grave of the pilot and found a stone marker there with what appeared to be a saucer-shaped object depicted on it. He also noted that this marker looked to have been desecrated as it was broken into two pieces. Following on from the Mars article, Bill Case, a fellow journalist, began his own investigation. He was also the head of the local branch of MoviePhone and brought a metal detector with him to the site to see if he could locate the wreckage that had allegedly been buried along with the pilot. From the readings on his detector, Case concluded that there were at least 3 sizable pieces of wreckage buried within the confines of the grave. But when he applied for an exhumation order to remove the metal, this was refused by the church authorities. In the aftermath of this refusal, the Move On investigator later found that the grave had been excavated by unknown persons with the marker removed and a length of metal pipe now buried under the ground. Now that this line of inquiry has been closed, the case began to look for witnesses. He was able to locate Charlie Stevens. Then, when he was in his late 80s, he told how he and his father saw the object moving north toward the town. A woman by the name of Mary Evans also came forward, who was 15 at the time of the crash and whose parents had seen the body and the wreckage the following year. Time magazine published an article debunking the crash in which they alleged that the entire affair had been fabricated by the author of the original newspaper story regarding the incident. A reporter by the name of Hayden, a local historian and longtime resident, was interviewed for this piece. Peggy's, the 86-year-old, told the magazine that in the years leading up to 1897, the town had suffered a catalogue of unfortunate mishaps. There was an outbreak of weevils which severely blighted the crops of the local farmers, followed by a widespread epidemic of fever and then a large fire which damaged several buildings. Peggy's claimed that when a nearby railroad, which was under construction, had been diverted to avoid Aurora, Hayden had conceived the story as a desperate attempt to keep the town relevant. She also said that Judge Proctor had never owned a windmill, and that the reporter had made that part of the story up as well. In November 2008, the judge's property, which had been bought from him by a man named Brawley Oates in 1935, was visited by a documentary called UFO Hunters. In interviews with his grandson, they learned that Oates had cleared the wreckage from the well, later claiming that the material had tainted the drinking water, afflicting him with an aggressive form of arthritis. Timothy Oates stated that as a result of this, his grandfather had blocked off the well with a concrete slab. He allowed the documentary makers to take samples of the water, which contained high levels of aluminium, and showed them the foundations of the windmill that had once stood on the site, seemingly undermining the testimony of Eta Peggies. It would not be until the morning of December the 17th, 1935 years after the incident, that the Wright brothers successfully piloted a powered flying machine, and with the witnesses of the Aurora crash, adamant that the craft involved was not a hot air balloon. Is it possible that it really was a ship from another world? This question is difficult to answer with any certainty. It is true that at the time, efforts to create a powered airship were finally starting to achieve success across the world. Rich industrialists kept helping inventors get their planes to fly for short periods of time in certain places. Unfortunately, this often led to accidents and deaths. The manner of the crash certainly seems to suggest that the technology behind the unknown vessel was rudimentary in nature, with the craft traveling in a slow and sluggish manner, unable to correct whatever defect would doom it to its fiery demise. The area to the south of Fort Worth is particularly well suited for flying and would later be chosen by the military as the site of one of the country's first air bases. So is it possible that some unknown inventor was killed piloting an experimental airship of some kind, as opposed to an alien visitor? From 1896 onwards, people all over the world heard stories about strange airships whose passengers talked to confused onlookers. These things started happening in the western part of the United States, but they quickly spread to Europe and as far away as Australia and New Zealand. With the start of the First World War, these unknown zeppelins were often seen flying over rural areas and shining strange lights down. Their crews were sometimes seen making quick repairs on the ground, and witnesses said that these flyers often spoke in strange languages, wore strange clothes, and ran away quickly to avoid being caught or found. Many of these reports were attributed to the German Air Force, who was suspected of attempting to perfect the zeppelins which would pound and pummel targets across mainland Europe during the coming conflict. And yet, with the defeat of Germany, it became apparent that no such expeditions had been undertaken, and that the technology described by witnesses was still decades away from being created. The Royal Air Force had invested no time or interest in the pursuit. So who in the world could have done it? The Aurora airship crash remains a polarizing subject. Many residents there claim that the event was very real and left a lasting impact on the community. Others bemoan the unwanted attention that Hayden's newspaper article had brought the town, the result of a cynical attempt to obtain national interest and investment evidence to support the allegation remains frustratingly as divisive. Recent claims have suggested that Mr. Williams was in fact the town blacksmith, and not a signals officer at all. Others claim that in the aftermath of Roswell, the government made efforts to cover up the affair, fearing further public scrutiny on the subject. Whether you think the person who died in the fields of Aurora on that foggy April morning was an alien or an inventor of an airship, the evidence points to the fact that the event did happen. And whilst we may never fully know the whole truth behind it, we can take heart in the very compassionate and humane manner in which the people of the small Texan town responded to the tragedy. If English is the what of the universe, mathematics is the how, and science is the why, the who, where and when are spiritual questions, but no less relevant than the other three time. For some dear case in point, you don't ask the what, how, why's beer. You simply ask the where, when, and possibly with whom.